Okay, I don't see anyone joining, so I think we may as well begin. So welcome everybody to this special journalism training masterclass. I'm Dave Cullen. I'm the program manager of the EVN. Um, just to remind you all that as with the usual format of the masterclasses, this event will be recorded, and an edited version will be posted on the EVN YouTube. I'm delighted to introduce John Mecklin. He's the editor-in-chief of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, Previously, he was editor-in-chief of Miller McLuhan, which was subsequently renamed to Pacific Standard, an award-winning national magazine that focused on research-based solutions to major policy problems. Over the preceding 15 years, he was also editor of High Country News, a nationally acclaimed magazine that reports on the American West, executive editor for the launch of Key West, a regional magazine startup directed by renowned magazine guru Roger Black, and the top editor for award-winning news weeklies in San Francisco and Phoenix. In an earlier incarnation, he was an investigative reporter at the Houston Post and covered the Persian Gulf War from Saudi Arabia and Iraq. Mecklin holds a Master in Public Administration degree from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He will talk for about 1 hour, and then we'll have 30 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions as he's speaking, please put them in the chat and we'll come to them afterwards. Thanks very much. Over to you, John.
Hey, thanks a lot, Dave. We're going to do a couple things here. First, I'm going to run through real quick. Here's what the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is, for those who may not know all the history and whatever, and then I will try in a compressed time explain how to tell a story and how to get what you're working on into general circulation, publications that aren't necessarily academic in nature. So I'm going to try to share my screen and do a couple of things, and I hope we don't do anything technically insane, but here you go. Okay, I assume you all can see my screen. That's just the logo of the bulletin. And
We can.
the bulletin started right after World War II in December of 1945. This is the first issue. It was, I forget, 6 or 8 pages, kind of a mimeographed pamphlet. And it was started by a bunch of scientists from the Manhattan Project and the University of Chicago who were afraid that the atomic bombs they had helped create, that the government, neither the government nor citizens understood what those bombs could do, that it could literally end the world. And one of the he wasn't actually a founder of the Bulletin, but someone who raised a lot of the money for the Bulletin was Albert Einstein. He was one of the initial people who was talking about what needed to change was how people thought, because this was the first technology that could potentially end the world. As you can see, they had an emergency committee with Einstein, the chairman. And the basic message was, there's no defense for these things, so we have to figure out a way to manage them. A lot of you may know of the Doomsday Clock. That started in 1947. That was because the scientists had always wanted, to get their word out, but that pamphlet they were putting out wasn't professional enough. It wasn't reaching enough people. So they decided they had to create a magazine. Magazines were the big media thing at the time. Time magazine, Life magazine, whatever. And they didn't know anything about making a magazine, but they knew they needed a cover. So they asked, one of the engineers had a wife who was an artist named Martial Langsdorff. They asked her to make a cover. She came up with several different possibilities, but they settled on this, a clock ticking down to midnight. And you'll see the minute hand at that time was set at 7 minutes to midnight. That was because Martial thought that looked good. And it was not thought that that hand necessarily was going to move. That wasn't part of the original deal on the cover. But then in 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear device that scared the editor at the time of the magazine. And Eugene Rabinowitz, he moved it to 3 minutes till midnight, which as a reflection of how frightening he thought the moment was. And since then, periodically, the hand has moved closer and further from midnight. Here it moved very close with both the United States and Soviet Union testing hydrogen bombs. And through the years, the Bulletin has gone through many different, aspects, designs, what it is. Here you see that the clock has gotten small, and they're playing with actually renaming it to something like a Journal of Science and Public Affairs. In fact, you can see that in a subsequent issue, they kind of look like, well, they're changing the name, but then they never really did. It's always been the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. I'm showing you this cover just to show it hasn't always been focused on nuclear alone. This is from 1978. This is our first cover story on climate change. And climate change was added formally to the Bulletin's remit in 2007. And our Science and Security Board considers both nuclear weapons and climate change to be existential risks, things that we need to focus on. As you can see, the design has changed through this time in the late 90s, early 2000s. It became really professionalized as a magazine. In fact, won the 2007 National Magazine Award. It's now entirely digital for both monetary and not killing trees reasons. This is a prior website that wasn't terrible, but this is kind of what we look like now. It's primarily served by this open website. We also have a bi-monthly subscription magazine. This website gets somewhere between 5 and 600,000 readers a month. So we're not the giantest publication in the world, but we have some real heft. This is an old thing. It has 12.2 million page views in 2022. It's quite a bit larger now. Our audience, this is again back in time. I didn't redo the slide, but you can see that something about 70% of our readership is 45 and below, which is incredibly young for a magazine that started 80 years ago. And there's a reason for that. It's because we want to grow and continue to have the Bulletin be something that speaks to everybody, not just to people my age or my parents' age. Now I'm going to skip through some of this other stuff, which is, I put together for a different kind of presentation. We also do biosecurity stuff. That's why this is on there. We have done museum presentations. We do a lot of art, and I hope to do more cartoons of this sort with Kim Jong-un, fooling the United States. And increasingly, the four areas we cover, nuclear weapons, climate change, and disruptive technologies, including biosecurity and AI. Those are what we cover here. I gather mostly I'll be focusing on nuclear matters, but we do cover all these other existential threats and increasingly how they intersect. Okay, so with this, I'm going to skip out of that. That's generally the Bulletin. Now I will, if I can, through the power of Okay. Now I'm going to go to what this is really about. Uh, I'm going to try to tell you how to tell a story, which is important if you want to get what you're working on, what you know, whether you work, for a think tank or the government in an academic setting, for in the nonprofit world, the NGO world. If you want general interest publications to accept your work and get it out so that more people know what it is that you think is important, you gotta you gotta know how to tell a story. This slide is up here. I am going to make it so that the basic people have access to these slide decks. This, so you will have this, so you won't have to take notes, but you will be able to know if you've attended this talk or see a recording of it. You can just contact me directly. You have the interest in publishing, whether in the Bulletin or some other significant publication that deals in international security matters. You can just email me directly because I think it's important that, sort of emerging experts, get what they're thinking out in front of large audiences. Um, so here you go. I'm going to tell you how to tell a story in 4 easy steps, even though it's impossible just to tell you how to write a story. I'll scare you first a couple of times. This T-shirt here, being a writer, it's easy. It's like riding a bike, except the bike is on fire, you're on fire, everything is on fire, and you're in hell. So it is hard to write well. Hemingway put it a different way. There's nothing to writing. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed. So after I've scared you there, I'm going to try to demystify this. Writing is hard, but if you have some basic precepts down, it's not as hard or as daunting as it might seem. I'm going to tell you, first of all, most of you, I suspect, haven't published in general interest magazines, newspapers, uh, websites that are intended to reach hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And so most of you, what you're writing will have been up to now will be in academic or think tank or nonprofit settings. And there's a real difference in that kind of writing and writing for a general audience. One of those is that much of what you've written up to this point in your career, I know I'm talking to people I don't know, but I suspect a lot of you, most of what you've written, somebody has been required to read it, whether that's your teachers, your bosses, if you're writing research papers, the people who are looking at it in a research journal or something are sort of required, they need the information in it. So those people are all need to read what you write. And it's different when you're writing for a general audience in that nobody in that audience needs to read what you're writing. For them, you need to give them a reason to want to read it. You have to interest them and hold their interest. So there's 4 differences in writing for an academic / research audience and a general audience. First one has to do with the purpose, whether it's just to shovel information to people or for a general audience, you need to have a combination of interesting them and informing them. It's like the story is an equation. It's how interesting is it and how important is it? That tells you how good a story it is. But it has to have some interest value. You can't just say, oh, this is important, and I'm going to bore the pants off the audience because they will just stop reading because they don't have to read it. And I've already begun to touch on the intended reader, general audience. They don't have to read it for academic or research or other purposes. They need to read it. So, I mean, you can write in the forms that research journals are generally written in. And part of the difference also has to do with language. And then the vast majority of my talk here will be about structure. But let's go to language. I mean, part of interesting people in what it is you have to say, if you're trying to get tens or hundreds or thousands or millions of people interested in it, has to do with the language itself. Now, for your average research article or think tank white paper, if you think about them, the writing is often flat as a pancake. In this little paragraph here from a noted writer, Gary Provost, kind of explains the difference. I'm just going to read it to you. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes when I am certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this, it's important. That change in tone and rhythm in trying to make the language connect to the reader, sing to the reader, is really important. And I understand in most, science or policy disciplines, that's not really paid much attention to. But if you want to reach a general audience, you absolutely have to pay attention to that. So now I'm going to move on to the sort of the heart of what I have to say. First of all, there is no one way to tell a story. By me saying I'm going to tell you how to tell a story, I'm fibbing to you. Good writers can tell stories in all kinds of ways and play with structure, play with style in a wide variety of ways. But if you're just starting out and want your writing to get into whatever, the New York Times, the Bulletin, the Atlantic magazine, whatever outlet you're looking for, foreign policy, you can help yourself get there by when you sit down to write, following this general structure. You want to start your story, as you can read here, with an opening that grabs the reader and just drags him into the story. And that is not generally the bottom line point of your story. It can be an anecdote. It can be a scene somewhere you've gone. It can be a bit of dialogue. What it needs to be is something that grabs a reader's attention. It has something to do with what you're going to write about. It grabs a reader's attention so that it doesn't stop immediately. You can read the first 2 or 3 or 4 sentences, maybe even 3 or 4 paragraphs of some kind of little anecdote or something that leads him like, what is this guy going to tell me? What is this person writing about? This is kind of weird or interesting. That little opening is the most important part of your story. That should be the best, as I say it, material you have for what it is you're going to write. The most striking thing, the thing if you sat down at the bar with a friend having a beer, you might tell them, oh, I'm working on this thing, and we wouldn't believe what this thing that I ran into. That's your opening. And that's your most important thing, because if people don't start reading your story into your story and stay with it for at least a few paragraphs, you've lost. It doesn't matter what else you write. Okay, right after, oops, you open the story, you tell the story in what you're going to tell the people in your story. You summarize it for them. One paragraph, maybe a couple paragraphs. You literally tease the main point or points you're going to make through the whole article. And this is a very important piece of your story. You need to try to write that theme paragraph or nut paragraph. Journalists often call it a nut graph. In Hollywood, they call it the Hollywood elevator speech. It's what's your story about? In, a paragraph or two before the movie executive steps off the elevator in a couple floors. So you're going to tell the reader, this is what I'm going to tell you in the rest of this story. And so this is something, the opening itself is really important. You ought to spend a lot of time working and crafting it. And then the nut paragraph is the same way. You ought to hone it down to the absolute essence of what you're going to tell the reader. You're telling them what you're going to tell them. You're not telling them everything at this point, but you're telling them, here's a little tease of what I'm going to tell you. And then you break. Sometimes in some stories, there's actually a little white space there or a little sub-headline or something, but you're going to break. You've opened your story with something compelling. You've told the reader what you're going to tell them about, and then you go back to the beginning of things, to the what I call the deep history of your story. If you're writing a story about Abraham Lincoln, at this point, you would tell your reader, well, Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin he built himself, whatever. You're going to go back to the very start of your story, of the whole of your story, the whole context. A lot of people who teach this just call this the context. You give the context for what your story is about. Now, this is kind of backwards if you've written, research journal kind of articles. They often start off with just a whole slew of context, the whole history of this before they get to the point, to the nut paragraph or whatever. And that's exactly backwards for a general audience. You've got to, with a real compelling opening, drag somebody into it. Now you've got them hooked, and you can take them back and show them, give them the context for why this story is important. And that will then, once you've told that deep history up to today, the current, what you're going to tell them about of your story, then you will break again and you'll have another section that is literally, here it's called the exposition. This is literally where you explain, usually in order, the subpoints that your nut paragraph included. You explain with more detail, and this is where you begin to provide what they call in storytelling lingo a payoff. You begin to tell the readers, well, this is why we started down this path anyway. I'm giving you the details on this so you understand how both interesting in a deep way and important this is. You've set the reader up to be able to go into that kind of detail without feeling bored and without feeling fooled. You have set them up. Here's what you're going to learn if you keep reading, and now you're telling them. So that if your nut paragraph is telling them what you're going to tell them, here down in the body, this is where you tell them what you told them you were going to tell them. This is where you do that. And then comes to your second most important part of your story. A lot of times people tend to think that, particularly with research articles, the endings can be, conclusion, and like a very dry restatement of what has just been told, or, sometimes they just kind of end flatly. In an article for a significant magazine or newspaper, the way you end the story is very important. So when I told you for your opening, you should take your best piece of material, the best scene where you could take a reader, the best dialogue that you have that introduced the story, whatever the material might be. For your kicker, for the ending of your story, that's your second best piece of material. Something that when you pick out what you're going to open the story with, all the other things you were thinking about for that, you pick the best one of those, you stick it in your back pocket, and you use that for a kicker. And they call it a kicker because it mentions the start of the story. It kicks back up to the story, to the start of the story, but in a way that has some snap, that's memorable in some way, that makes people go, wow, oh, I get it. That's why they open the story this way. And so this ending should, if you're writing a piece, should be something, A, that you're thinking about when you've already chosen what you're writing toward when you start the article. And then when you get down to the end, you should spend some time crafting that ending, that kicker, to have real impact, real snap, because that's what you want people to remember. If they don't remember anything else about your article, you want them to remember how it ends. You want them to go into the bars with their friends and say, you wouldn't believe this story I just read, and tell them about the ending to your story. So that is my real quick how to tell a story, even though I admit there is no one way to tell a story. But if you follow this general scaffolding, you will find out you're pretty close. I mean, you aren't going to run into many editors who go, what is this? You left out something. No, this covers the basics of telling a story. Now, here's an example of, it's like a classic story. And, the people at Basic will have this deck. So you can look at, but if you Google just Frank Sinatra has a cold, you're in for a treat. This is Gay Talese wrote it. I mean, this is a reprinting of it in 2007. It's written a long time ago, but it's written without ever actually getting an interview with Frank Sinatra, and going through a time where disaster has occurred to Frank Sinatra. He's caught a cold and he's got to perform in a day or two or three. And it's really worth your read, and it will illustrate for you that scaffolding I just showed you. This is the opening to it, and I'm going to read it, even though it's a little bit long, because it illustrates what I was talking about when I said your opening isn't some dry recitation of, here's what I'm going to tell you. Here's what a real opening is like. Frank Sinatra, holding a glass of bourbon in one hand and a cigarette in the other, stood in a dark corner of the bar between two attractive but fading blondes who sat waiting for him to say something. But he said nothing. He had been silent during much of the evening, except now in this private club in Beverly Hills. He seemed even more distant, staring out through the smoke and semi-darkness into a large room beyond the bar, where dozens of young couples sat huddled around small tables or twisted in the center of the floor to the clamorous clang of folk rock music blaring from the stereo. The two blondes knew, as did Sinatra's four male friends who stood nearby, that it was a bad idea to force conversation upon him when he was in this mood of sullen silence, a mood that had hardly been uncommon during this first week of November, a month before his 50th birthday. Sinatra had been working in a film that he now disliked, could not wait to finish. He was tired of all the publicity attached to his dating the 20-year-old Mia Farrow, who was not in sight tonight. He was angry that a CBS television documentary of his life, to be shown in 2 weeks, was reportedly prying into his privacy, even speculating on his possible friendship with mafia leaders. He was worried about his starring role in an hour-long NBC show entitled Sinatra, A Man and His Music, which would require that he sing 18 songs with a voice that at this particular moment, just a few nights before the taping was to begin, was weak and sore and uncertain. Sinatra was ill. He was the victim of an ailment so common that most people would consider it trivial. But when it gets to Sinatra, it can plunge him into a state of anguish, deep depression, panic, even rage. Frank Sinatra had a cold. Now that, in some ways, is like the best exemplar of how you open a magazine story I can imagine. And it took some imagination, some thinking about how do I make a scene where nobody's talking into something that will grab a reader by the lapels and drag them in. This is up on your screen, The Body Electric. It's an article that was in Outside magazine back in time, 2014, about somebody who got struck by lightning and lived. And it is just, I am putting it up here. If you want to go read something that is, it's a great story, but you will see the structure that I laid out just come alive in really dramatic fashion. You might want to go read this. Okay, now, in a more practical vein, you have something you've been working on. You want to get it into whatever, some newspaper in the op-ed pages, some magazine, as whether it's a medium length piece or a longer piece, wherever you want to put it in a general interest publication, you've got to send what's called in the business a query letter. You've got to find the right editor to send your pitch to. It's basically a pitch. You're telling the editor what you have to write that you think he should want to accept, and after some editing, put in his publication. And there's a general form. Nowadays, most pitches or queries are sent by email. I mean, I suppose you could send it by regular mail, but that's just not the way it's generally done. So the first thing you need to do is, okay, you decide you want to put it in whatever magazine. Let's just pick one out, the Atlantic magazine. The first thing you need to do is go read the Atlantic website to figure out, get an idea of the tone, what kind of stuff they publish, and also to look through to find out the right editor to send your pitch to. In most websites, will give you an idea of where to send your pitches. I generally tell people, we'll spend a little time trying to find people who know people who might know people at the publication, because just sending it to their general submissions inbox, although, I mean, editors, I'm an editor, I know, we actually review what goes into our submissions inbox and whatever. It's just not as efficient a way, and it's less likely that editors are going to snap to your pitch if you just send it to that general inbox. So spend a little time reading the publication and finding out the right editor to send it to your pitch. And then your pitch needs to have these elements. And you'll see that it kind of closely follows what I tried to give you is the structure for writing a story. First of all is the lead, which is really just a boiled down one paragraph version of your opening, and that's it. It's just the most grabby piece of your story so that it grabs the editor's attention. As you can see on the screen, the next section is another paragraph that just gives the bottom line, the nut graph of your piece, along with, and this is just perfect for the Atlantic magazine, and you can even tell them for the whatever front of the book section of your magazine because of this and that and the other thing. Then there's this here calls the nuts and bolts paragraph. It's mostly just the details of the story. It's particularly important to let the editor know you actually have the story. You've already done some pre-research. So you have documents or sources or whatever that will allow you to write this story. And then you should have done enough research on the magazine to know, how long of a story are they looking for? What would you title it if you were going to title it? And then you end your query or your pitch with a paragraph of, here's why I'm the perfect person to write this. And you all are emerging experts, and this should be the easiest part of your pitch to write. It's like, hey, I know about this because this is what I've studied for X number of years, or I work with this think tank and we've been dealing with this for all this time. So in some way, these elements in about one computer screen are what you would email to the correct editor of the publication you want to be published in. Another resource you can look at, something called Writer's Market, and it will give you, for essentially every publication in the world, what the editors are looking for, if anything, from freelancers or people they haven't published before. And I would recommend it's a quick thing to glance at. And if you don't have access to people who know people at these publications, you probably should take a look at Writer's Market. Okay, this is my sort of wrap up of what I've told you. This is a drawing that I gave one of these classes, and there was a science communicator, a woman who was a nurse and communicated mostly medical information, but she did it through cartooning. So she drove this, and wrote this for me, drew it, and I thought it was wonderful. So I'd just pass it on to you as a way to remember what I've said, that writing for a general audience is different in purpose, who the intended reader is in the language. Remember, pay attention to how the language sounds, its tones, its rhythms, that it's beautiful is important. The structure that I gave you were an opening and a nut paragraph, the deep history and exposition in a kicker. Remember this general structure. You will never be lost again trying to write a story if you remember it needs those 5 elements. And remember, nobody has to read your writing. You have to make them want to read it. And then there's a final note that I really didn't go into here, but I think I have to since I'm speaking to people from an organization called BASIC, which is kind of its own acronym. As you can see here at this other talk, I told them, I'm tired of crossing out acronyms. And I really am. If you're trying to write for a general audience, kill all the acronyms. Take them all out. Anything less easily known than in the United States, FBI or CIA. Anything else, get rid of it. Spell it out if you need to in full the first time. And then just, if it's the Department of Defense, you can just call it the department or whatever from then on. You should never call it the DOD. That's, you all will know that is the acronym for the Department of Defense. But you know what? Acronyms are tiny poisonous ants that bite readers on the eyes. Every time you put an acronym in your story, you're telling a reader, I don't care about you. You may not know about this, but I know it. I'm an expert in this field. So I'm going to litter my story with all these acronyms crawling all over your screen, making your eyes hurt. Don't do it. Get rid of your acronyms. Okay. And you and your readers will be happier for it. So I don't know, since I've got my whole screen here taken up with a sharing, I'm going to stop sharing now and come back here, say hi to you all and see where the time is and say I'm ready to take questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, John. That was absolutely brilliant and vivid, really wonderful. Um, yes, it is time for questions now. I might start us off with one that's been mulling over in my mind. I'd be interested to hear how the Bulletin is different from other publications you've worked on. If you could say a little about that.
Uh, the Bulletin is sort of unique in the world is that what we publish, we are a magazine and we publish magazine journalism. But to my knowledge, we're the only magazine that focuses on existential risk. So if you're writing about nuclear weapons, particularly, we're going to be interested in it in a way that other publications wouldn't be. And we are a magazine. We strive to be as well written, as accessible as the Atlantic, the New Yorker, or whatever. But we are a wee bit wonkier. You can go into a bit more detail and a bit more. Here's, done whole articles about how hydrogen bombs work, how the hydrogen bomb was created. You can go into some real scientific and policy detail. We're still going to edit it very closely to make it accessible to a general reader. It can't be something that smart people who aren't expert can't understand. But the Bulletin is basically a magazine that will let you go a little deeper into your subject if it has to do with existential risk. And it's also a magazine that explicitly wants to promote younger authors. I understand this audience is composed of a lot of those. This is one of the only publications where we will work with you specifically to get you published in that kind of format, help you learn how to write for a general audience. Because I have a whole editor, Dawn Stover, who has written for and edited for just New York Times, Scientific American, all these things. She does our Voices of Tomorrow program. And I've worked with younger authors for decades. So, you know, if you're looking to get what you're working on to a general audience and learn how to do it, this is a place to start.
Fantastic, thank you. So we have a question in the chat and one hand up. Yes, just to remind participants, you can put your hand up if you wish to ask a question. That's absolutely fine. I'll call to you in due course. But the question in the chat came first. So we have a question from Shaz Arif. Thank you for this insightful session. From your experience, how can journalists strike the right balance when communicating nuclear risk, ensuring the issue remains accessible to audiences without falling into sensationalism or oversimplification?
Um, that's just a matter of basically not trying to scare the bejesus out of people. You know, the nuclear weapons are scary enough all on their own. Just know what it is you want to write about and present it, remembering what I just said is talk to people who aren't experts in your field, aren't experts in nuclear weapons, and use language like you would, and I always tell journalists when I teach them, you know, tell it like you were sitting at the bar with your best friend who's a smart, man or woman, but really doesn't know a thing about nuclear weapons. Explain to him why what you have to say is important and interesting, but in the kind of language you'd use just talking to your friends. If you write it like that, it will be accessible and it won't be sensationalized because you wouldn't do that with your friends.
That's great. Thank you very much. Franco, you had a question. You're welcome to turn on your camera if you would like to ask it, or you can just do it verbally.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, John. Apologies, I can't turn my camera at the moment, but John, thank you so much for the talk. It was fascinating, and if you will allow me, I wrote down 4 questions that I wanted to ask you. You don't have to answer them all, but uh,
Oh, let
uh,
me get my pencil out. 4 of them. I'll have to write them down.
Um, the first question I had was about how do you assess how good a story was written, other than perhaps the number of views? Do you give it to a friend and family member to assess their reaction? Do you read it out loud to yourself, or what do you usually do with your own pieces of writing? The second question I had was about whether uh, you ever revise something that you've already published, but thought that could have been written better, or maybe you got feedback that it needed to be told, the story needed to be told differently. Um, yeah, so I was wondering if you recommend any editing or revising process post publishing a piece. Um, and the third question I had was about whether when do you choose what to write about? Is it just when you care about an issue, or do you have several pieces you're constantly working on and waiting for an opportunity to publish? Um, yeah, or do you prefer to focus on one piece at a time? That was my third question. And lastly, I was curious about the Frank Sinatra example because I thought that the kick line at the end, Frank Sinatra had a cold, sounded like a very good title. So I was wondering, how do you choose about, for instance, the phrasing of your title, which I think was not the key, was not in the main structure that you originally gave. So those were my questions, and thank you very much.
Okay, I ought to be able to run through some time here answering those 4. How do I assess a story? It's Well, first of all, I've been in the business for 40 years, so that's, having read a lot of stories, it's pretty obvious first time through on most stories whether it's got something there or not. But it's by what I talked about, the combination of interesting and important. How good a story is it? Is like an equation. It's like multiply how interesting is it times how important is it? And that sort of gives you how good a story it's going to be, pre-publication. And that is obviously that's a matter of judgment. Different editors could judge different things as more or less interesting and important. But if both those things aren't pretty obvious from the start, it's kind of, you know, you're going to have to search for, well, if it's what the person who wants to write about this has sent you something that's really just boring as boring can be. It's, the like reading the phone book or something. Sometimes it's just so important that you will work with the author to figure out the things that you can do to make it interesting, the human interest or feature elements that can be added into it. But that basic, how interesting, how important it is the basic way pre-publication I assess it. Post-publication, there's, obviously there's all sorts of metrics of how many people read it and whatever, but I am of the firm belief that how many people read a story does not explain whether it was important to do it. You cannot be just publishing stories to get, quote, as they say, clicks. If that's all the Bulletin were interested in, we'd be running lots more cat pictures and stories and things like that, cats and nuclear weapons. I mean, it's just, we want interesting and important, meaningful journalism. So that's question number one. Whether we revise things that have been already published, not per se, no. I mean, post-publication, if we get complaints about an article and we investigate and there's something factually wrong, we will, correct it, prominently publish the correction, that kind of thing. But just for, I've got a bunch of editors and it's their job to make these stories readable, interesting, and whatever. Sometimes we don't do as good a job as we would hope with that, but the time for us to make stories better, to revise them, is before we publish them, not afterwards, in general. And please remember, everything I say is in general because there's an exception to everything. When does how does a writer choose what to write about, or, when? I mean, how to manage workloads is something that, I mean, the writers who work with me and our editors, that is something that we teach them over time, our editorial fellows, whatever. It's basically, if you want to be a writer who's published fairly regularly, yeah, you should be working on 3 or 4 or 5 possibles at any given time. In managing which ones of those you're focused on and how much of your time and energy you're focused on it is a matter of learning, and knowing yourself. There's some people that really can't have 4 or 5 stories on their story list and be working mostly on story number 1 and 20% on story number 2 and lesser amounts on stories 3, 4, and 5. They just can't do that. And you got to know yourself whether you can or can't. I can be working on 7 or 8 or 10 stories at once, but that's because I've been doing it since longer than most of you have been alive. So it's a matter of learning. It's, and predilection and whatever. How you choose what to write about is tell people, yeah, don't try to write about something that bores you. Make sure you think it's interesting. If you think it's interesting and do a little research into it and still think it's interesting, then you can almost certainly make it interesting to readers. On headlines, titles to stories, and whatever, it's an interesting topic, and we have had John Pope, who's on the screen here, has helped us with bringing in experts in terms of how we workshop and write our headlines and whatever. It is, a work of art and a different kind of thing in the internet world. I mean, how people find articles increasingly has to do with the headlines. So we write headlines like I've told you all, open your story with something that's incredibly grabby and that readers will grab onto and want to read into it. Well, headlines are even more that way. And there's lots of tricks to it. What we try not to do is fool people in the headlines. We try to make the headlines something where you want to click on it so you can read the story, but we don't want you to click on the story, the headline, expecting to get X and you get story Y. There's a lot of that fake kind of teasing on the internet, and we just don't do that. So we don't do cat videos, and we don't do fake headlines. So and it's fine, and we like it when authors submit stories and here's the headline they think would be a good headline. And sometimes it's the best headline we can come up with. But the reality is, at the Bulletin, the editors write the headlines, and we keep that within our power just because we have spent a long time learning how to write headlines that will get your story as many readers as possible. And a lot of writers don't really have that kind of background. All I can see is Declan has a hand up there.
Let's come to Declan. Go for it, Declan.
Yeah, thank you very much, John, and thanks for this excellent presentation. I think it's been really useful, and especially for those of us used to policy or academic writing, giving us a different way of thinking about our writing and getting out some of the more boring practices that we get up to. But my question is actually something that'd be a bit of a change of subject to do with journalistic skills that I've wondered about for a long time, because my sister actually was a journalist and trained up for it and has left the industry, but still works in communications. But I can remember when she was doing her degree, seeing her learn journalistic shorthand, and it was very interesting to see and how efficiently she could write notes very quickly. And I've always kind of wondered, would that be do you think that could be a useful research skill to have when note taking, for example, say in the field, and how feasible, how easy or difficult is it, for example, to learn this skill? But it's something I've always wondered if that would help me a lot when even taking notes at an event like this, whether that be a very efficient, really useful skill to have for somebody when trying to take down a lot of information quickly, or whether that is something that's very difficult to learn. So I'd be interested to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I learned how to take notes on the fear basis. I got a job as a reporter, and I gotta get all of this stuff down, and it developed sort of my own version, shorthand. I never did study, actual shorthand. I have seen reporters who have and actually use it. I would think that would be a useful thing. I would think the fear method is actually a good method of learning it. It's just, to have to go and, I mean, a lot of times people in different settings who aren't journalists never just sit down and, I mean, you could just watch a video and try to take notes on it and see, and then go back and see what you got and what you didn't, and if you do 10 or 15 minute stretches of that, I think you would quickly become better at it. I would also counsel people to, when you're writing something in a journalistic fashion, it's seldom that you actually need or use direct quotes. Direct quotes should be when somebody says something in a way that's just so powerful. You couldn't possibly write that as well as they just said it, right? And so when you're taking notes, you want to be listening for that. And when, somebody starts into that, holy shit, I need to get that. That's when you start to write real fast and try to get all that down. And then, of course, there's I hate to tell people this, but it's the modern way of journalism. Any iPhone, it's got its own microphone. You can get little plug-in mics, and in most settings, You can get that in front of a speaker or get it somewhere that it can hear that. And, iPhones unfortunately won't themselves immediately transcribe that recording, but you can send it to another computer and, use Otter or any of the other transcribers and get it transcribed. So in some ways, technology it's not, I tell everybody, don't rely on that. Take notes, because machines break, technology can break, and you never want to be, oh, I'm getting ready to write a story, I have no notes, and the recording won't work, or the iPhone burnt itself up. So do both if you can. And if you can only take notes, listen for the killer quote, and otherwise, getting enough to paraphrase is generally good enough. It's, you want to get better at note taking, but I don't think that's the signal of a good journalist. The signal of a good journalist is listening for what's important. What are they saying that's really important here, rather than being a stenographer?
Thank you so much. Chiara has a question. Go ahead, Chiara.
Hi, John. Thank you very much for this presentation. It was very useful. I have kind of a follow-up question to what you and Declan were just talking about any skills that you think journalists or young professionals in the field in nuclear policy should develop or improve, given, the amount of AI that is being used out there. And then I have a second question. If in your career there has been a point where you've decided not to publish something that you were actually going to publish, and what informed that decision? I'm thinking about, when President Donald Trump announced resuming nuclear testing, and everyone, of course, was writing about it, right? Oh my God, we're going to go back to the old age, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out he misspoke. So I'm also thinking, how can we maintain the credibility given also the amount of misinformation that is out there? Thank you.
I'll go backwards and you can remind me of your earlier questions. The misinformation and disinformation part of it is, it's just basic media literacy, and you can't just do a Google search, click on things, and necessarily believe it. You're going to have to actually learn, well, sort of a hierarchy. You can pretty much count on, if you read something in the New York Times, there's going to have been a real effort to report that out, to have at least 2 solid sources, usually more, that kind of thing. And there are outlets that have that going for it. And then it's not that you ignore other smaller outlets or whatever, but if there's information, somebody has put up, the United States has conducted a secret nuclear test and it's on some site. You just have to ask yourself, how do those people know it? Did they tell you how they knew it? How many sources did they give? What's their reputation? And then for something important, just saying some other site or news organization or whatever said something is generally not good enough. I want reporters to report it themselves. If the New York Times talked to this person and that person about this? You know, those officials shoot off emails to their press people, ask them, did they really say that? You know, it's just basic reporting is how you get around this flood of nonsense that is, and I understand, you know, you see all this. I would tell people, you just video, you cannot just believe it. You have to do this reporting to be sure that's real, because people really can make videos that you won't be able to tell are faked. That's really possible now. It happens. Have, you know, President Obama saying horrible things, you know, in the India-Pakistan war, they had I think it was somebody in the Pakistan government ordering a nuclear alert on their forces. That didn't really happen, but it was a very realistic video of that. Well, how do you not go with that? Reporting. You just have to, you can't just believe that video. You have to, until you get confirmation from at least 2 and hopefully more sources that you believe, you don't go with it. Now I've talked long enough that I forgot your other questions, so maybe you can remind me.
Sure. One of them was about if you're in your career, there's been an instance where you didn't end up publishing something that you had originally intended to, and what was the cost? And the other one, I mean, I think you've touched upon it a little bit, but if there's any other specific skills, you know, I'm hearing reporting, writing, but any other skills that you think that young people in the nuclear policy field should develop or become masters at?
Yeah, I think a
Yeah.
lot of people nowadays, you know, learn to type, but definitely touch typing. I'm surprised by how many people are trying to do hunt and peck with keyboards. And when you're trying to be efficient with your time, that's a real, you know, it also gets in the way of writing things fluently. So, you know, yeah, learn how to type, folks. You know, in terms of, it's actually not that often that I've told people, accepted a story and coming up to we're about to publish it and go, oh, yeah, maybe we shouldn't. The only times I can remember have to do with, you know, the kind of thing that you said. It's like, you know, okay, we wanted to do a quick story on Trump and nuclear testing, but I had asked people, and people had said they were going to write about it, but by the time they got to writing about it, the reality of what was known had changed. It was unclear whether what in the world he was actually talking about. You know, was he talking about testing missiles or testing nuclear warheads or doing these really small tests? You know, even now it's not clear. So we didn't immediately do stories on that. Trying to think. I don't think because we focus on reporting and expertise so much as the Bulletin, I can't think of a time that we got up to sort of close to publishing. And then all of a sudden I realized, oh, this is horrible, or it's libelous, or it's, you know, wrong or something. It's just, that's, you know, the weeding out of that happens much earlier in the process than we're ready to publish it. and other skills. The one that people in this age, particularly younger people, forget about is talking on the telephone. I know that's slower than firing off emails, and there's nothing wrong with emails, but actual talking to people, it blows a lot of bad things out of the way, particularly because some of you come from sort of a policy, NGO, think tank, academic sort of background. I emphasize, if you're going to write for a general audience, if you say something bad about somebody or an organization, give them the chance to explain why you're wrong. Every time. Because if you call them and ask them, is this right? Now, they may blow you a bunch of smoke. You may publish it anyway. In fact, if it's right, you probably will, you probably should. But so often the answer makes your story better. They give you details you didn't know and things you couldn't have known, and so it's kind of important in my mind that, even if you're going to say, Pete Hegseth is, talking out his ears and, whatever, call or email the Defense Department. They have, public relations people whose job it is to get you an answer. Often, even though it may be uncomfortable to do that, do it, because that uncomfortable thing will make your story better.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I don't see any other questions. I'll just ask one last one, if I may. I was interested, John, I hope this isn't too much inside baseball, to see the term new journalism in your presentation. I'm not sure that would be familiar to everyone who's watching this. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. And, for my own curiosity, did new journalism become the default? Is there any of the old journalism left?
New journalism was a tag people gave to, there was a time when magazine journalism, particularly, they started to use literary techniques that had previously only been used in fiction in the telling of stories, meaning describing people and how they really are, and, long strings of dialogue, things that, in your average newspaper or even a news magazine, these things just weren't done, and some of it got kind of, in my mind, kind of went off the rails a little bit with, Tom Wolfe and electric Kool-Aid acid test and, really wacky language and all sorts of stuff. But and nowadays people don't usually, except in a historical talking about that era, don't use these terms so much. It's sort of the difference between, say, wire service or true newspaper journalism, where it's just the facts, ma'am. The lead is, what's the most important thing, and then the second most important thing, pyramid style kind of telling of it. That kind of journalism is used to some degree, but in most journalism now is a blend of magazine journalism and that more, that inverted pyramid style of writing was created because of time. It's like somebody reporting on something happening right now for, say, a wire service. They had to tell everybody what had just happened. So if you write in that who, what, when, where, why, and then the next most important, you can't really go wrong with telling the facts, and you can spit it out quickly. But nowadays, it's most writing is a combination of that with not literary, but some effort, as I described, to interest readers in the story you're going to tell. Some use of color, description, scenes, language even, to draw readers into stories and to make the stories more accessible to more readers. As I put it to a lot of people, the New York Times is in a lot of ways now almost a daily magazine. That's what the now unfortunately departed David Carr, their great media critic, said the Times had become sort of a daily magazine. What the news magazines or even magazines, how they used to write is now sort of a default or a standard for most journalism. And that distinction between new journalism, old journalism is mostly just a fun thing to talk about in his, historical terms. But now it's mostly by outlet. You can read the Bulletin, and we have a style. You read enough of our articles, you get an idea of what a Bulletin article is. It's the same way with the different sections of the New York Times, the different sections of the New Yorker. So this all sort of swings back around to my telling people, if you want to write for a general audience, know the publication you want to pitch, even the section of that publication, by reading it, because that will give you not just what kind of content you might pitch to them, but how you're going to write it, in what format, more or less magazine-y or new journalism-y, or more tending toward, just the facts, ma'am, old journalism. That will be told to you by the outlet.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I think that probably draws us to a close. This has been really rich and brilliant, John. I'm sure this will get a lot of attention when we publish the VODs in due course. Thank you so much for giving up your time, and thank you to all of our audience and everybody who asked a question. And we will see you the next time we do an Expert Masterclass. Thank you, and bye-bye.
No, thank you all. It was a joy, and thank you all for staying late to listen to me. I appreciate it.